It's really a joy to be with you, and Martin is such a beautiful individual, and I'm very honored to say he's my friend. You know, it was interesting because he was talking about inner peace and wisdom, but I would also like to add the rest of that, which I think is critically important and which should sit with that, is compassion and love. I'll tell you a little bit about myself, but before I do that, I would also like to thank the wonderful musicians here, because I hope you felt as they were playing the deep soulfulness of that music. And this music, how it can get into your heart and even open your heart. And really that's what my talk is about today. So people look at me, and yes, I'm a professor at Stanford, which is an extraordinary place, and I was fortunate to also be in business. So when people look at this pedigree, they make an assumption about who you are. They make judgments. And oftentimes the judgment is that I'm a white male of privilege. Now, I am privileged because I've been allowed to go on an extraordinary journey, which I would like to share with you, and hopefully also shows that making those judgments isn't necessarily valid. What the most important thing is not titles, it's not what you've accomplished, unless that accomplishment is connected to service to others. You know, I tell people I went on this journey and I ended up having everything, but then realized I had nothing. And when I had nothing and gave everything that I had left away, then I had everything. So my story begins as a child, and I grew up in poverty. My father, and neither of my parents had gone to college. My father was an alcoholic. My mother had sadly had a stroke when I was a child, was paralyzed, had a seizure disorder, chronically depressed, attempted suicide multiple times. We were evicted from various places at times. And as you can imagine, that's not the ideal environment in which to succeed, at least by the criteria most people use to succeed in life. And in fact, there's something now called adverse childhood experiences. Have any of you heard of that? It's an area of study now where it uses these markers, and they're quite accurate in terms of how a child will progress in life. And if you have poverty, if you have mental illness, if you have alcohol or drug abuse, if you have violence, all of these contribute to you not succeeding in life. And in fact, being unhealthy, oftentimes being in prison. And it's horribly, horribly unfortunate because, you know, a child starts out as having this incredible potential, and then these life events can change that. So by the time I was 12, I had despair, anger, hopelessness, fear, and no hope. So what happened to me that allowed me to be with you today? And in some ways, it completely relates to the conversation that just happened before. So interestingly enough, what happened to me was that I walked into a magic shop. And in fact, there's a book that I wrote called Into the Magic Shop, A Neurosurgeon's Quest to Discover the Mysteries of the Brain and the Secrets of the Heart. And it ended up being a New York Times bestseller. It's now in 40 languages. And do any of you, have you ever heard of the K-pop? Anybody follow K-pop here? Come on, there's got to be more than one person. You guys are denying it. There's actually a band called BTS. It's a boy band. And they're quite deep in terms of every album and song that they write. And actually, they based their third album on my book. So it made my book a big bestseller in South Korea. But at that point in time, at 12, filled with such a sense of hopelessness and a feeling that I had no future, I walked into a magic shop. And I had this interest in magic, and this shop was far away from where I lived. I just happened to be riding my bicycle by, and I walked in, and the owner wasn't there, but his mother was there. And frankly, she knew absolutely nothing about magic, at least the magic in the store. But what she did know about was human beings. And hopefully all of you have met a person or personality who, when they look at you, they have this radiant presence, a smile. Their presence embraces you. And what happens when somebody gives you that gift? Because what that gift is acceptance, non-judgment, looking at you as an equal, and accepting you unconditionally. And when that happens, magical things happen. Because what that does is it creates a sense of psychological safety. And when you're safe, believe it or not, your physiology works at its best. Because then you have full control of your executive control functions. You can use experience. You can use knowledge to make discerning judgments. Because when you're in a fear mode, which is what I grew up in, you are reactive. You're not always making the right decisions. You're scared. And that engagement of your sympathetic nervous system is profoundly unhealthy when it's chronic. So this woman and I talked, and after about 15 or 20 minutes, and she asked me actually some deep questions, which is that age I was already ashamed. I would hide my background. But she asked these questions, and I answered them honestly. And at the end of this period of time, she looked at me and she said, "You know, I really like you. If you come here every day, and I'm here for another 6 weeks, I'll teach you something that I think could change your life." Now, how many of us get an opportunity, or how many of us have given someone an opportunity to share their knowledge unconditionally to help another who is suffering? So that's what she did. So what did I learn from this woman? What I learned was that my own fear, my own anxiety, resulted in me in constantly being tense, being afraid, always looking around because I didn't feel safe. And when you are not able to attend, you cannot learn. You cannot succeed. Because to learn, you have to be present. And the other thing she taught me was to truly connect with another, you must be present. And in fact, when you are present, magic happens, and again, your physiology works its best. So the first thing she taught me was a breathing technique a technique on how to relax. And magically, over a few weeks, I was able to do that. Now, when she first started this, you can imagine as a 12-year-old what I was thinking in this back room with this woman. And I was going, what the hell is going on here and why am I here? And the initial motivation was because, frankly, I had nothing else to do. But the other was she was giving me chocolate chip cookies. So that was a very important driver of my behavior. And once I was able to do that, she asked me what I thought of myself. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, tell me about the conversations that go on in your head. Now, how many people in this room have a conversation going on in their head? And I would suspect that for many of you, if not most, it's not the one that says, you're a great guy, you're fantastic, you're wonderful, right? It's the one that says, you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're an imposter, people are going to find out about you, right? You know, I was giving a talk one time, and I said this, and this woman says, I don't have a voice going on in my head. And she said, everything's wonderful in my life. I couldn't respond to that. So what was going on in my head was exactly that negative conversation. And I didn't even know that that conversation was not me. I thought that voice was truth. And what happened was, she showed me that that voice was a collection of negative comments that I had heard, and I turned it into what I thought was truth. Because as a species, negativity sticks to us oftentimes because that engages our survival mode, negative things. Positive things don't stick as much because it doesn't put us at risk. But this is a side effect, unfortunately, of our evolution. So I told her when she asked me all of these things, and she made me realize that that narrative, when you say you can't, when you say it's not possible, when you say you're not good enough, what it does is it's like you're building a prison for yourself, brick by brick by brick. Because once you say you can't, it is not possible. Yet what we forget is that each of us has this extraordinary power within us. And unfortunately, when you build these bricks, it takes that flame of who we are and makes it a little flicker that can barely be seen. And that's what I had done. Brick by brick by brick, I had created this isolating prison. And as those bricks get higher, it gets darker. And you continue this negative narrative to yourself. And what this woman taught me was that that narrative was false and it was not me. And in fact, it had nothing to do with me. It was a false narrative. And she taught me, and now we call this self-compassion, because so many of us, we are our own worst critic and beat ourselves up every day more than we would do to any other person. And she taught me to have self-affirmation, to know that I deserved to be loved. How many in this room, when somebody gives you a compliment, you can't look them in the eye? You go, right? As if you don't deserve to be acknowledged for how wonderful and special you are? Because that's what they're doing. And you turn away from that? Because you do deserve that. Everyone in this room. You know, people also carry this burden of a shadow, self. And it's that part of you that you wish was not a part of you. And somehow you think every other human doesn't have the shadow, and therefore there's something bad about you. And the thing is, so many people spend time pushing that shadow away, but until you embrace that shadow and recognize that it in fact is you, and that even in the face of that, you deserve to be loved. So once she allowed me to be kind to myself and learn how to do that, something happened also. Because it was as if a window that had been covered in dew, where I couldn't see through it, suddenly got clear. Because when you're in constant pain like that, you can't see. And what I then saw was that everyone is suffering in some way or another. And I realized then that everyone was in the same situation as myself. And like this woman was giving a gift to me, once I recognized that everyone is suffering, then I could give that gift of compassion and hopefully that radiance of spirit, that unconditional acceptance to another. But it's hard. You know, it's easy to do if it's your loved one, if it's a neighbor who's a friend, maybe even a coworker, maybe a neutral person. It gets much more challenging as you get to the person you don't like or the person you loathe, et cetera, et cetera. But when you spend the time to look at that, it changes everything. So what happened from that experience? This woman lastly taught me something, the power of manifestation of intention, and taught me how, by using repetition, by writing my goals and aspirations, that would start cementing within me the ability to have these things manifest. And indeed, they did manifest. I believed suddenly I could go to college. I believed I could go to medical school. I became a neurosurgeon. I became a professor at Stanford. I became a successful entrepreneur of a company that went public for $1.2 billion. And I had made a list when I was this woman of 10 things that I wanted to accomplish. I wanted to own a gold Rolex. That's what 12-year-old. I wanted a Porsche. I wanted to live in a mansion. I got all those things, every one of them, in spades. So here I am suddenly having what so many people aspire to and what every one of my friends said, wow, this is amazing, you're doing fantastic. And I was single at the time, and I was dating all these beautiful women. And I would either come home or wake up miserable. Miserable. And I couldn't understand it because I had done everything. I had done everything that I thought would bring happiness. So what happened, interestingly enough, in this misery, where I had everything, I had been involved in .com stuff, and when the market crashed, in 6 weeks I lost $80 million and was bankrupt, and $3 million in the hole. And do you know who becomes your best friend when that happens? Are there any bankers here? That was my new best friend. So my Ferraris, my Porsches, my penthouse. And this put me into a period of deep, deep reflection. Because on the one hand, this woman had given me this extraordinary gift, but on the other, what had I missed here? And so I went through this reflection, and I realized what I had missed. And don't get me wrong, I was never a mean or an evil person, but I spent my whole time trying to prove something, and it was about me. And that always being about me was what resulted in this sense of deep loneliness and unhappiness. So I was at this bifurcation, and I had actually given a significant amount of stock in this company that had yet to go public to charity. And I had no money. I was $3 million in the hole. And I was talking to my lawyers, because they also get involved with your banker. And my lawyer called me up. He said, "Jim, I have extraordinary news for you." I said, "What?" He said, "Well, you know, we were supposed to file these papers that gave all the stock away to charity, and the attorney, the junior attorney, had not done it. So actually, you don't have to give anything away." And this is the company that went public for $1.2 billion, where I was the CEO. So this put me in an incredible quandary. So I surveyed my friends, and actually the woman I was dating at the time, and I said, "What should I do?" Now, what do you think 100% of them said? No, that was 0. So not a single person said that. So what I did was I gave everything to charity. And that company then went public, and I became this extraordinary philanthropist. I set up health clinics all over the world, blood banks, built a wing of a hospital, set up research centers, endowed chairs at universities. And suddenly, I had everything. Because it was no more about me. It was about being of service to others. Because you see, it is how we are designed as a species to love, to care. And when you do that, your physiology works at its best. You have this warm feeling. The centers in your brain that are associated with reward and pleasure are activated. And you know, it's so interesting because I spend a lot of time with different groups of people. And oftentimes, the privileged, the wealthy, you talk to them and they're deeply suffering. And because so many people look up to these people as successes, these people think that by having people admire them and want to be like them, that will fill that emptiness that they have. And there's a Tibetan mythology about the hungry ghost. And it's this ghost with this very thin throat. And no matter what they stuff into it, it never can fill them. Yet the thing that gives us transcendence, the things that make us truly human, the things that give meaning and purpose are when we are of service to the other. And as was said earlier, what the problem in the world is, it's not about not having enough resources. It's because so often we look at someone else as the other instead of ourselves. And when you look at the other as yourself and the world as your home, everything changes. And that's when your physiology works at its best. So how the hell does this have to do with business? Have any of you heard of a company called Google? It's a shitty company. So, you know, you may not know this, but when Google started, and Sergey and Larry, they believed that the best people were those who attended about 15 universities in the world and were in the top 5% of their class. Because, of course, that's what makes successful people. And that's the people who make the best decisions, right? But interestingly enough, as they acquired more companies, they hired a lot of people who didn't fulfill those criteria at all. But Google being Google and being very analytical, they did something called the Aristotle Project, and they spent $50 million on this. Now, instead of going over multiple years and $50 million, if they had just given me $50 million, in 2 minutes I could have answered this question for them. So what did it turn out that made a leader and a successful team? And let me tell you first, though, because Google employs primarily people between the ages of 25 and 45. Do you know where their greatest expenditure in healthcare costs is? Stress, anxiety, depression, mind-body disconnect. Additionally, when you're suffering from those, what else happens? You're disengaged from work. We call it presenteeism. How many of you have been at work and your mind's elsewhere? Nobody in this room, of course. Or absenteeism, of course. But the other thing that happens is productivity goes down when you're scared. We talked about executive control function. When you're in a fear state, you're not as productive. Your work isn't that good. You're less creative. So the costs of stress, anxiety, depression, mind-body disconnects, huge. But then look where it spills over. It spills over in human resources costs, right? It spills over in lack of productivity. And so it's hugely, hugely important in businesses to recognize that oftentimes their employees are suffering, and they're suffering deeply. I gave a talk at the University of Edinburgh to the executive business school people, 150 people or so. I said, how many people in this room have had an experience in their life that was so painful that they carried with it that experience to work? It affected them profoundly. Do you know how many people? Every person, right? So I said, okay, how many people in this room, when you were suffering like this, felt your employer was sympathetic and there for you? Do you know how many people raised their hand? One person. And I asked him about that. He said, well, my uncle's the CEO of the company. So what does that tell you about companies? And as was pointed out with our last speakers, the techniques that are necessary to change that, frankly, are extraordinarily cost-effective because fundamentally they are free. I give a talk sometimes, and I say, if I had a pill for you, that the ingredients were readily available, there's no side effects, that could help with the vast majority of these problems, how much would that be worth for a pharmaceutical company? Billions, right? Trillions. Because actually, this is a problem that's now throughout modern society, Western society, which shows you how screwed up Western society is, frankly. And then if I said to them, okay, the thing about this pill, though, is that there's one requirement when you take the pill. After you take it, you sit in silence for 20 minutes, slowly breathing in and out. And then if you actually do that, you don't really need the pill anymore. And this is true. So what did Google find out from this extraordinary experiment? Amazingly, they found out that if a person was vulnerable and authentic, people seemed to respond to that. What a shock. The problem in modern society is that, have any of you heard of the blue zones in the world? These are these places where people routinely live to be over 100. Now, diet certainly has something to do with it, but there's some of these places where people smoke and drink like fiends. And it's the same, but why is that? Because these are places where the entire environment is one of psychological safety. You grew up there. You live in an intergenerational family. You have the same neighbors and friends you've had since childhood. And guess what? With every bad thing you think you have, what do? They love you. Period. That's it. It is connection. It is feeling safe. It is being given unconditional love and acceptance. That's what changes everything. So, in modern society, what happens? You have people get up on stage and they say, I'm a professor here, and I've done this, and I've done that, because they're afraid of showing their vulnerability. I mean, there are people who work in the next cubicle, people have sat with them for years, and the person has never shared that their spouse had cancer, that their child has illness, that they're profoundly suffering. They never open themselves up. Yet it's that opening themselves up, showing their vulnerability. You know, when I stand on stage and my voice cracks or I shed a tear, do people scream at me and tell me I'm an idiot? Well, one or two may. But you know what? Most people want to give me a hug. Right? Because when you show you're hurt, when you're in pain, we evolved as a species to intuit facial expressions, body habitus, vocal intonation, even smells, to determine if somebody's suffering. Because our species need that caring, because they don't swim off when they're born or go off into the forest. They have to be cared for 10, 15, in my case apparently 35 years, to be loved and nurtured before they can be independent. So we have to have a system where we care and embrace. And do you know what the reward for that immense amount of energy expenditure and time? It's a sense of pleasure, reward, and your body, your parasympathetic nervous system is engaged, and your physiology works at its best when you care. So, by being vulnerable, by being authentic, people are able to intuit that and respond. How many of you walked in a room where somebody is like this? Does that make you feel safe or happy? Of course not. Versus somebody says, it is so great to see you. You know, I love you because you're just a special person. I love your work. I love you. And I just thank you for being here. Of course, everybody in their business environment get that every day, right? But it makes a huge, huge difference. Huge. So, vulnerability, authenticity. Guess what the other thing was? Being non-judgmental, right? You know, it's so amazing because oftentimes, even unconsciously, we look at somebody and we make judgments about who they are, what they're worthy of in terms of what we give them. And so often, we're profoundly wrong. And I'll give you an example. How many of you read Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning? So there's this talk about between stimulus and response, there's a pause. Because oftentimes when somebody comes on to us aggressively or we make a negative judgment about them, it's because we have immediately engaged our sympathetic nervous system and we're somewhat being defensive oftentimes. We're making judgments about why they're reacting or acting a certain way. Yet when you learn to master that reaction and take a pause, that's where your freedom is. And that is when you engage your parasympathetic nervous system, because then you have full access to your executive control function. So this friend of mine came in one day, he's a physician, we're doing a project together outside of our normal jobs. And we have this meeting and he's a complete jerk. I mean, like he's so aggressive. I mean, I'm actually shocked. And what do we do typically when somebody comes on to us so aggressively. You either protect yourself or you get aggressive, right? Well, fortunately, having the experience of learning from Viktor Frankl and seeing that this was so unusual, I looked at him and I said, you know, this isn't you. He looked at me. Burst into tears. I asked him what was wrong. He said, well, you know, I was taking this other position that's not starting for 3 months. We're going to work together. He says because, you know, he's fairly young, has young children, healthy. In the United States, to continue your health insurance, you have to, if you quit your job, you have to do something called COBRA, which is this gap-filling insurance. He hadn't done that. And his wife just found out she had breast cancer. No insurance. So the issue had nothing to do with me even. Right? Yet I could have made this judgment about why he was reacting a certain way. Now, fortunately, we were able to take it back and retroactively get his COBRA, and everything is fine, and his wife turned out being fine. But it shows you what happens when we make judgments, when we react to people, because so much of what we do is actually not based on even now. It's based on what happened some time ago. Like people's mental state changes by the time they get to work if they've been in an argument with their spouse. I mean, I certainly can relate to that. Not that I've only had one argument with my spouse. She's had many with me. So this idea of perspective taking, looking at the other, being non-judgmental. And the third aspect that they learned in this incredibly expensive study at Google was creating this environment of psychological safety. And in some ways, what they're trying to replicate is what this woman in the magic shop gave me, right? So she had this knowledge. So I'm going to tell you another story. So I was ill prepared to go to college because of my challenges in school. And I had to work. And when it came time to apply to medical school, my grade point average, and in the United States we have a 4.0 system, which is A, excellence, right? The average grade point average to get into medical school was 3.79. My grade point average was 2.53. And in fact, I had wonderful friends who told me I would never get into medical school. How many of you have told a friend an aspiration, a dream? And they said, no, you'll never do it. These are even relatives. And you know, I've met people who have carried that with them their whole lives, where a parent or a friend told them that they weren't going to be anything. Yet if you tell somebody you can accomplish great things, you're special, you have this incredible ability, that is another gift that will let them sail and fly. So anyway, at my university, to get a letter of recommendation, you had to go to a pre-med committee. So I go into this office to ask for this appointment, and the secretary's there, and she pulls my application. And she says, I'm not giving you an appointment. I go, why? Because it's a waste of everyone's time. Now, could you imagine another human being telling you that you're a waste of their time. So I looked at this lady, and I said, well, I appreciate what you're saying, but I'm not leaving here until you give me the appointment. And if you want to call security, fine, but I'm not leaving. So she does. Now, what a joy it was to walk into this room with these three professors at the end of a long table, and they were sitting like this. And the one in the middle, he took my file, and he threw it on the table. He said, say what you have to say, and let's get this over with. So I looked at this guy, and I said, who gave you the right to destroy people's dreams? I said, there's not one bit of evidence, as we saw from the Google experiment, that having a high GPA has any relationship with success in life. I said, I am not going to allow you to objectify me because of a number. And then I proceeded to lecture them for 45 minutes. But at the end of it, you know what? Once you force somebody to look at your humanity, it's impossible to look away. And they were all crying. So they ended up actually giving me the highest letter of recommendation. So as I walk out, the secretary, she looks at me, and she had been listening. She says, I think you should read this and apply. I said, what is it? She said, well, there's a summer program for kids who were from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds or minority students at Tulane University in New Orleans. She said, but I have to tell you, the deadline has passed, but I don't think it'll have an impact for you. So I applied to this summer program, and guess what? They accepted me with that grade point average, and I didn't even get a degree. So I had no degree. In fact, the president of the university and the dean still remind me that I am probably the worst candidate who ever applied to medical school. But let's go full circle here. So after Hurricane Katrina, have you guys heard that? It devastated the South. So it flooded New Orleans in my medical school. It flooded, it damaged the library severely. They had to move the medical school to Houston. The dean went into a depression. He resigned. So they were looking for a new dean. And the dean was, the guy who they wanted was from Harvard, and he wanted an endowed chair. Do you guys have endowed chairs here? These are these chairs that a philanthropist gives and endows, and it's really the highest attainment in academia to get an endowed chair. And they wanted to hire this guy, but they didn't have the money. So I endowed the dean's chair. So the dean is now the Doty professor of the medical school at Tulane. I rebuilt the library, and I set up a multi-million-dollar scholarship in the name of that woman. Right? To show you that none of us can judge either another suffering or what someone is capable of. And all it takes to turn that flicker in someone to a flame that allows for them to thrive and be their best selves is simply compassion and love. So thank you.